So what is prospect utilitarianism, all right? So I'll first introduce what prospect utilitarianism is. It's kind of like a version of utilitarianism that I presented, and introduce a recent criticism raised by Ben Davis in Utilitas, and kind of basically R, meaning Susumu and R, kind of like responds to that criticism because we think that the criticisms are based on fundamental conceptual misunderstandings of the concepts of welfarism as well as continuity. All right, so let's start. So sufficientarianism, all right? So in Equality as Moral Ideal, Harry Frankfurt presented a distinctive ethical theory which he called the doctrine of sufficiency. According to Frankfurt, so he says that with respect to the distribution of economic assets, what is important from the point of view of morality is not that everyone should have the same, but that each should have enough, right? So if everyone had enough, it would be of no moral consequence whether some had more than others. I shall refer to this alternative to egalitarianism, namely that what is morally important with respect to money is for everyone to have enough, as the doctrine of sufficiency, right? So basically, the ethical theory now goes by the name Sufficientarianism, and many ethical theorists and political philosophers have presented different versions of Sufficientarianism that retain the general spirit of what Frankfurt had proposed in his seminal work. Okay. So basically, we can kind of like summarize Sufficientarianism as consisting of two basic theses, and this kind of like basically comes from Paula Casso. So there's a positive thesis, which basically says that it is morally important for people to have enough material resources. And there's also a negative thesis of Sufficientarianism that claims that once everybody has enough material resources, relative inequality, that is, whether somebody has more or less than others, has absolutely no moral significance. Right. So as a generally, I think that there are two basic desiderata, which I think any distributive principle of ethics should ideally satisfy. And the first is that I think that it should give right answers to so-called lifeboat situations. That is, it should provide intuitively plausible prescriptions on how we should distribute resources under conditions of scarcity. And second, I think that continuity is also a desiderata. Right? So the problem which I raise against Sufficientarianism is that it satisfies neither of these desiderata. Right? So, all right, so let me briefly illustrate how Sufficientarianism fails to give right answers to these two desiderata. So consider the following lifeboat situation, which is basically comes from Harry Frankfurt himself with a slight modification of a threshold of reasonable contentment. So let the size of the population be, let there be 10 people, and let there be 40 units of resources that we can basically distribute. And suppose that the threshold of critical survival is 5 units of resources, and the threshold of reasonable contentment is 10 units of resources. Okay, so intuitively, other things being equal, we would normally think that we should save as many people as possible. And in this case, the maximum number of people that we can save is 8 people. So normally we think that any distributive ethical theory should prescribe, should imply that we should save 8 people, right? So if we take the threshold of reasonable contentment to be the number of thresholds Sufficientarianism aims to satisfy, then sufficiency yields a distribution that saves 4 people instead and kills 6. And this basically implies a wrong answer. However, if we take the threshold of critical survival to be the number of thresholds Sufficientarianism aims to satisfy, then Sufficientarianism can actually save 8 people, but then its negative thesis becomes no longer plausible because the negative thesis says that as long as people have enough, relative inequality does not matter. But if we think that the threshold is set to bare survival, it is not intuitively plausible that relative inequality, after people have just simply met the threshold of bare survival, is no longer ethically significant. Right? Okay, and that's the second problem is that here's an illustration of how Sufficientarianism fails to provide continuous ethical judgments. So what does it mean, first, for ethical preferences to be continuous? So basically, John Romer basically says that informally, ethical preferences should be continuous. Informally, continuity means that there are no jumps in the ethical preference order. Continuity is ethically attractive. It says that 2 states that are almost the same in terms of the welfare levels of society's members must be viewed as almost ethically indifferent. So all versions of Sufficientarianism, whether you subscribe to the headcount version or the non-headcount versions, fails to meet this property. right? So here is a simple illustration. Suppose that there are two people. Suppose that the critical sufficiency threshold is 10, and let the x1 and x2, the pair, denote a distribution where x1 goes to person 1 and x2 goes to person 2. Then we can see that the distribution that gives 9 to person 1 and 10 to person 2 is ethically preferred, strictly preferred, to the distribution that gives 10 minus 1 over n to both people for all natural numbers n, right? But we can see that the latter distribution, when n goes arbitrarily large, it converges to a distribution that gives both 10 and 10, which is actually preferred to the distribution that gives 9 and 10, right? So here we can see that the ethical preference relation abruptly changes in the limit, and therefore the ethical preference relation that respects sufficientarianism fails to meet continuity. All right, so in 2017, I published a paper entitled Prospect Utilitarianism, a Better Alternative to Sufficientarianism in the journal Philosophical Studies. So in the paper, I tried to show how utilitarianism with the right kind of restrictions can solve our current problem, that is, solve the problem of finding the right distribution principle that retains the main attractions of sufficientarianism while avoiding the two basic problems that sufficientarianism fails to satisfy. So what is utilitarianism? Here's kind of like a brief overview of it. Utilitarianism is basically a distributive ethical principle according to which a distributional state that generates a greater total sum of individual welfare is ethically preferable to a distributional state that generates a lesser total sum of individual welfare. So let's try to understand this a bit formally. So let n be the set of n individuals who are members of a given society. Let x, which is a subset of Rn, be the set of all feasible distributions of material resources. Right? So a typical element x is going to be a vector, x which, with n coordinates, n components, where each component, xi, is going to represent the amount of material resources allocated to individual I. Okay, for instance, if we have some distribution that looks like this, kind of like it represents that individual 1 is going to get 3, individual 2 is going to get 2.2, and so forth. Right? So we're going to assume that each individual has a utility function that basically transforms wealth into welfare, that is unit comparable. So given an allocation of monetary wealth or resources, right, individual I's welfare level at that specific allocation is going to be this. Right? And according to utilitarianism, the social welfare, U, under a specific distribution of wealth, X, is going to be defined as this. It's, the social welfare is simply the total sum of individual welfare that is generated by the specific distribution of resources. So we call the function U the utilitarian social welfare function, and according to utilitarian social welfare function, an allocation, a specific distribution of resources X, is socially preferred to another allocation or distribution Y, if and only if Ux is greater than Uy, which means simply that the total sum of utility that is generated by distribution X is greater than the total sum of utility generated by distribution Y. Okay. So here, a standard objection to utilitarianism is that utilitarianism may sacrifice the rights or welfare of some individuals for the sake of achieving greater aggregate social welfare for society as a whole, right? And in extreme cases, utilitarianism may justify the institution of slavery. So this is kind of like the version of like John Rawls's criticism that utilitarianism does not take seriously the distinction between like people, the separatenesses of persons objection. Then we should ask how much inequality does utilitarianism actually generate, right? So here is kind of like a toy example. Suppose that there are like two individuals, and suppose that we have a society has 10 units of material resources that can be distributed to each of these two individuals. So the set of all socially feasible distribution is going to be X is going to be all pairs, all vectors of x1 and x2, such that x1 and x2 are non-negative, and they also sum less or equal to 10, right? So suppose that utility functions both for individuals 1 and 2 are linear. Then we can see that this represents the set of all feasible distributions. So basically, any point in this triangle represents a specific distribution of resources that is feasible, in a sense. We are also assuming that individuals have linear utility functions, which means that their welfare increases linearly with more resources. And in this current setting, basically, the indifference curves of the utilitarian social welfare function is going to be straight lines, like this. So here, each point on the same line represents a distribution of resources toward which utilitarianism finds socially indifferent, and social preferences move this direction. And whenever there's an increase in the total sum of individual utility, then utilitarianism will basically prefer that. So then what would be the distributions that would be prescribed by utilitarianism? What we do is we basically overlap the utilitarian indifference curves over the set of feasible alternatives, and basically choose all the distributions that put us on the highest indifference curve of utilitarianism, which in this case would imply that any distributions that are on the hypotenuse is going to be compatible with the utilitarian distribution that is prescribed by utilitarianism. So here we can see here that this contains infinitely many distributions. Notably, it contains extremely unequal distributions in which one person gets 10 and the other person gets 0. But it also contains a distribution in which both people get like 5, a completely equal distribution. So what we can say here is that when individual utility functions are linear, it's not that utilitarianism will necessarily imply an unequal distribution, but it is actually compatible with an unequal distribution, and so forth. Now, let us slightly change the example and assume that individual utility functions are strictly concave. Suppose that they have a logarithmic, right? So in this case, we're assuming that individual utility functions are strictly concave. They display decreasing marginal utility. When we do that, then we can see that the indifference curves of the utilitarian social welfare function is going to become like convex towards against the origin, and it goes like that. So if we, in this case, if we basically overlap the utilitarian social welfare function over the set of feasible social distribution, we can now see that the only distribution that is uniquely prescribed by utilitarianism is a completely equal distribution here, right? So the main lesson that we can kind of like learn from these toy examples is that the distributional consequences of utilitarianisms are underdetermined until we specifically characterize the individual utility functions. So utilitarianism becomes more and more inequality averse as individual utility functions become more and more concave. Utilitarianism becomes inequality neutral when they are linear, and utilitarianism becomes more and more inequality prone as individual utility functions become more and more convex, right? So, all right, so basically, here's a slight digression on the curvature of utility functions and risk attitudes. So in modern decision or utility theory, expected utility theory, one's attitude toward risk is usually reflected in the curvature of the person's utility functions. So basically, an agent is risk averse if and only if the agent's utility function is concave. And here is an example of a risk averse person, which basically shows that for this person, the utility of the expected value of a lottery is greater than the expected utility of the lottery, right? So the person will basically prefer to receive the sure outcome, which gives him the expectation of the lottery, to any gamble that will give him the expected utility, right? So similarly, an agent is risk-seeking if the agent's utility function is convex. And here is basically an example of a convex utility function that represents a risk-seeking individual. And an agent is going to be risk-neutral if the agent's utility function is linear. And here is a linear utility function and so forth, right? Now, I'll basically briefly introduce Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory. So as we have seen, the distributional implications of utilitarianism heavily depends on the specific characterizations of each individual's utility function. So suppose we characterize individual utility functions in accordance with the way individual utility functions are characterized in Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory. So according to prospect theory, decision makers tend to assign value not to final assets, but to changes, that is gains and losses assessed from a perceived reference point. And decision makers tend to display different attitudes towards risk for gains and losses. Specifically, decision makers tend to be risk averse towards gains and risk-prone or risk-seeking toward losses. So Kahneman and Tversky say also that the aggravation that one experiences in losing a sum of money appears to be greater than the pleasure associated with gaining the same amount, which implies that the utility function for losses is steeper than the utility function for gains. So you combine all of this, taking everything into account, we basically arrive at the following general characterization of individual utility functions. So in summary, they say we have proposed that the utility function is first defined on deviations from the reference point, second, generally concave for gains and commonly convex for losses, and three, steeper for losses than for gains. So basically this is kind of like an example that comes from their article, which they kind of like depict the type of utility functions that would be consistent with their kind of like prospect theory, right? So then, what does all this have to do with prospect utilitarianism? So let us characterize our basic model society. So consider a society again with n individuals, n, and we're going to use, I'm going to use xi lower bar to denote individual i's critical sufficiency threshold, and that it is going to denote the amount of material resources the individual needs to adequately function as a normal human being, or something like that. So we're going to allow each individual's critical sufficiency threshold to be different. For instance, if individual I has diabetes and individual J is, has diabetes and individual is in all other aspects similar to individual I but does not have diabetes, then we're going to assume that the critical sufficiency threshold, the amount of resources that each person needs to meet their reference point, is greater for individual I than individual J. So maybe individual I needs to periodically buy insulin shots, which requires him or her to have more resources to kind of like function at the same level at individual J without having to take any insulin shots or something like that. Okay, so we're going to define U. U is going to be our reference utility function that is going to be cardinally measurable and unit comparable, such that we're going to set the welfare, the utility of zero as zero, set to 0. We're going to assume U is strictly increasing in material resources. U is continuous for all x and differentiable for all x. This should be a set minus sign, not a yen sign, excluding 0. And U is strictly convex below 0. U is strictly concave above 0. And for every x and y, such that x is below 0 and y is below 0, the slope of the utility function is greater for below 0 than it is above 0. Okay? So the characterization of our reference utility function U basically conforms to the general characterization of individual utility function described in prospect theory. So here is basically what our reference utility function is going to look like. Okay, so now we're going to define each individual i's utility function from the reference utility function. So we're going to basically define each individual utility function as a horizontal translation of our reference utility function, such that it's going to move the reference utility function and set the 0 to the point at which the person's critical sufficiency threshold lies, right? So it's going to move U to this amount, right? So we're going to let E be basically a vector of endowments. And endowment is, EI is the amount of material resources with which individual I starts and owns from the beginning, which cannot be taken away and redistributed. And we're going to have C, which is a non-negative number, denote the amount of material resources that is left for distribution among the individuals. In that case, from this, a distribution problem is going to be represented by four tuples, the reference utility functions, each individual's reference, critical sufficiency threshold, the vector of endowments, as well as the amount of resources that are left for distribution, right? Not redistribution. So a feasible distribution in our current setup is going to be a vector such that each xi is non-negative and the sum total is less than or equal to the amount of resources that are left for distribution. Okay, so here is kind of like a basic example that shows what we're doing. Suppose that there are 3 individuals, and each individual 1, 2, 3's critical sufficiency threshold is 1, 2, and 4, and suppose that their endowments is 2, 1, 2, right? So here we have the reference utility function, basically, individual 1's utility function is this, individual 2's utility function is this, and individual 3's utility function of this. And basically, 1 has 2 resources, 2 has 1 resources, and 3 has 1 resources. That's the amount of endowments that they kind of start with. Okay, so in our current setup for each distributional problem, right, utilitarianism is going to solve the following problem. It's going to find a distribution of resources such that it maximizes the individual sum of utilities with that satisfies the budget constraint, right? So basically, simply put, for each distribution problem, utilitarianism aims to find a way to distribute the remaining material resources that maximizes the total sum of individual welfare, right? So here now are the results. So the first result is that prospect utilitarianism gives right answers to lifeboat situations. So proposition 1, prospect utilitarianism gives priority to people who are below their critical sufficiency threshold over people who are above their critical sufficiency threshold. And proposition 2 says that among people who below the sufficiency threshold, prospect utilitarianism prioritizes people whose sufficiency threshold can most easily be met, right? And this implies that prospect utilitarianism is going to give right answers to lifeboat situations. So here is an illustration of how this works. Suppose we have 3 units of resources that are left to distribute. What prospect utilitarianism is going to do is that it kind of we can see that individual 1's reference point is already met. Individual 2 and individual 3's reference point are not yet met, but there's individual 2 is 1 unit below the critical sufficiency threshold, while individual 3 is 2 units below its critical sufficiency threshold. So first, our prospect utilitarianism is going to distribute 1 unit of resources to individual 2 to allow individual 2 to meet their sufficiency threshold, and then distribute the 2 remaining resources to individual 3. So it's going to allow everybody to meet their critical sufficiency threshold in their distribution. Okay. So the second point is that prospect utilitarianism gives continuous ethical judgments, right? So due to kind of a lack of time, I'll kind of quickly go over this. Ethical preferences induced by prospect utilitarianism are continuous. So it basically solves the 2 problems that I initially raised against Sufficientarianism. And now the rest of the results are going to show that it basically retains all the major attractions of Sufficientarianism. So the point is that proposition 4, after maximizing sufficiency, prospect utilitarianism prioritizes the individual who is worse off in terms of his or her welfare level. So this basically implies that prospect utilitarianism is prioritarian when everybody is above the critical sufficiency threshold. And basically, it has a built-in sort of bias towards equality in a similar way that prioritarianism has a built-in bias towards equality. So basically, it can appeal to prioritarian intuitions as well. So here is an example. Suppose that we have 2 more distributions here. Then you basically distribute the 2 more resources to individuals 2 and 3. Now, doing that, everybody is 1 unit above their critical sufficiency threshold. Suppose that we have 3 more resources, then we kind of basically distribute the 3 to all 3 here. So the next result is that prospect utilitarianism incorporates the weak negative thesis. So the weak negative thesis basically says that as 2 people have more and more material resources, the ethical significance of their relative inequality matters less and less. And basically, proposition 5 says that prospect utilitarianism implies the weak negative thesis, so forth. So our moral intuition tells us that the relative inequality between the rich and the super rich is morally insignificant. And one reason why people are attracted to Sufficientarianism is that it seems to explain our moral intuition in those cases, right? So such moral intuition is also adequately explained by prospect utilitarianism as it implies the weak negative thesis. Okay, so the following basically describes prospect utilitarianism's algorithm for distributing an extra unit of resources. First, it tries to check if there are any people who are below the sufficiency threshold. Second, if there is one person below the sufficiency threshold, give that resources to that person, right? If there are more than one person below the sufficiency threshold, then give the resources to the person closest. And note that this is well defined to his or her sufficiency threshold. And if everybody is above his or her sufficiency threshold, give the resources to the person closest to his or her sufficiency threshold, right? So the upshot is that prospect utilitarianism retains all the major attractions of sufficientarianism while avoiding its shortcomings. Specifically, it recommends a distribution that always maximizes the instance of sufficiency and hence give right answer to lifeboat situation. Second, it explains why we are not morally disturbed by the relative inequality between the rich and super rich, which kind of like connects to Roger Crisp's like Beverly Hills example, right? And it does these things without sacrificing continuous ethical judgment. So furthermore, when everybody is above the critical sufficiency threshold, the practical implementation of prospect utilitarianism is equivalent to the practical implementation of prioritarianism, promoting equality. So the point is that prospect utilitarianism is I claim, a total package that can appeal to a wide range of ethical theorists. It has elements that can appeal to utilitarians, sufficientarians, prioritarians, and egalitarians at the same time. Okay. So now, to this, recently Ben Davis basically published a criticism of prospect utilitarianism in Utilitas. So in a recent paper titled The Prospects for Prospect Utilitarianism, Ben Davis criticizes my view, and basically the paper tries to accomplish two things: to defend sufficientarianism from my criticism, and to criticize prospect utilitarianism on independent grounds. For the purposes, one, Davis argues that recent non-headcount versions of sufficientarianism can provide right answers to lifeboat situations by considering benefit size, and sufficientarianism can also provide continuous ethical judgments, right? And for the purposes, two, argues that my reliance on adequate human functioning to define each person's sufficiency threshold leads to theoretical problems. All of Davis's criticism, I think, are based on fundamental conceptual misunderstanding, but it is a conceptual misunderstanding that is very important to clarify. All right, so I'm not sure how far I can move on with this. So I've been like discussing this criticism with like Susumu Kato for a very long time, and there were a lot of like intense distribution because we needed to like figure out exactly. We know that it was wrong. The criticisms were misplaced, but we had to precisely understand specifically at which point Davis's argument and criticism were confused, right? And it took a long time for us to basically clarify what it was. So here, let's talk about continuity per se and welfare continuity, which is a distinction that Ben Davis makes. So again, that's continuity. So we may think of continuity as a formalization of Aristotle's like principle that requires to treat like cases alike and different cases differently. And to understand continuity, one must first ask two social states that are almost the same with respect to one, right? Because continuity says that the two states that are almost similar should be ethically almost like the same. So definition of continuity assumes a space or a domain over which moral evaluations of ethical preferability are made. And if the domain under consideration is a space of resources, then continuity claims that there is a continuous relationship between the distribution of resources and ethical preferability. If the domain under consideration is a space of welfare, then continuity claims that there is a continuous relationship between the distribution of welfare and ethical comparability. So basically, I was committed to the view that there's a continuous relationship between the distribution of welfare and ethical preferability. But Davis calls this welfare's continuity and distinguishes it from what he calls continuity per se. So this is what Davis says. He says that continuity per se is an attractive feature of an ethical view if understood as saying that whereas only a slight difference across all ethically relevant features between two outcomes, this should not make a big difference to our ethical preferences. But we can clearly embrace a principle of continuity understood in this way while rejecting welfare's continuity, since two outcomes may differ only slightly in welfare, but differ more significantly on other ethically relevant factors. For instance, egalitarians will strongly prefer a distribution A, which has identical population welfare, to distribution B, but where the welfare is much more equally distributed. However, sufficientarians can plausibly reject welfare's continuity while embracing the less specific principle of continuity I have suggested, right? So here, Davis is basically asserting two claims. Although continuity in general is plausible, welfare's continuity is not. Although sufficientarianism violates welfare's continuity, it can still satisfy a more general continuity of, and so forth, right? So both claims are basically false, right? So here's why. So to understand precisely, we need to clarify a couple of things. So, okay, so first, I'll kind of like, all right, so how should I summarize this in a way, most efficient way? So first of all, Davis, he mistakenly labels welfare's continuity as what might be called a total population welfare continuity, which might be defined as follows, right? So consider any two distributions of welfare and any sequence of welfare whose total sum converges to the total sum of welfare contained in V, right? Then this basically says if U is preferred, ethically preferred to V, then any distribution that is sufficiently close to V should also remain dispreferred to U as well. So that's kind of like total population welfare continuity. But this is different from welfare continuity, which basically says that if there are like two distributions of welfare where V and a sequence of welfare distribution that converges to V, if U is ethically preferred to V, then any distribution of welfare that is sufficiently close to V, U would still be ethically preferred to that, right? So the point is that TPWC is a much stronger condition than welfare continuity. In particular, TPWC logically implies welfare continuity, but welfare continuity does not logically imply TPWC. So that's the result. And basically, the example that egalitarianism will strongly prefer distribution A, which has identical population welfare to distribution B, but where the welfare is much more equally distributed, is an example that shows that certain ethical views may plausibly violate TPWC, but it is not a counterexample to welfare continuity. So it is also a mistake to call TPWC welfarist because very few welfarist ethical theories actually satisfy it. Actually, the only welfarist theory that satisfies TPWC is utilitarian in the presence of weak Pareto, right? So the point is that this is a much stronger requirement than welfare continuity, and I'm not committed to that. And so the point is that Davis mischaracterized me as being committed to TPWC, which I haven't, right? So according to another point is that according to Davis, autonomy is an example that shows how sufficientarians can reject welfarist continuity while accepting a more general principle of continuity. So he kind of like says that sufficientarianism can plausibly reject. Okay, so okay, so he basically says what he says is that plausibly reject welfarist continuity while embracing a less specific principle of continuity, as I suggested, and kind of like an example would be autonomy. So his kind of like basic view is that it is possible to have two identical distributions of welfare, one paternalistically imposed and the other autonomously chosen, and prefer the later for non-welfarist reasons, right? So, all right, so due to time, okay, so I wasn't, sorry about, but okay. No? Yeah, so, okay. So the main kind of like point is that, basically I want to kind of like make is that, okay, there are like different kind of like results. So there are basically two questions. There are two distinct questions that Davis fails to separate. The first is that should welfare be the only relevant consideration in our ethical consideration? And the second question is, should our ethical evaluations be continuous? And welfarism basically says yes to the first question. Utilitarianism says yes to both questions. However, the answer to the two questions are independent. A yes or no to answer to the first question does not force one to accept a yes or no question to the second. And Davis wants to say yes to the second question and no to the first question. If that is the case, Davis's criticism is against welfarism, not continuity. And as a matter of fact, his purported counterexamples and criticisms are targeting welfarism, not continuity. And there are also like other more important stuff here, but I would have to like stop at this point. I'm extremely sorry, and I apologize for not being able to convey everything in this talk.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to take questions now. Professor